Today is May 25th, 2026, Memorial Day weekend in America, the weekend set aside to honor every soldier who gave their life in service of this country. And on this specific Memorial Day weekend, nothing is pausing. Trump canceled his plans to attend a family wedding and stayed at the White House instead. American service members across every branch had their Memorial Day weekend leaves canceled. Pentagon sources confirmed that strike packages were actively being prepared to give the president immediate military options if the diplomatic situation collapsed. An intelligence report revealed that an IRGC-connected Iraqi national had been arrested with a blueprint of a member of Trump's family's Florida home, having made a specific pledge to murder her as revenge for the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. The arrested suspect said explicitly, "We need to kill Ivanka to burn down the house of Trump the way he burned down our house." And then, instead of bombs dropping, the global information environment received a shockwave from a completely unexpected direction. 3 Iranian officials confirmed the existence of a memorandum of understanding. Iran started celebrating. Iran's foreign ministry posted historical memes about ancient Persian empires establishing peace on their own terms. American senators and former cabinet officials immediately called the deal a catastrophe that undoes everything Operation Epic Fury achieved. Pakistan's prime minister said there is no deal yet and expressed hope to host more talks soon. American officials said Iran committed in writing to giving up its enriched uranium. Iranian officials said the nuclear question is deferred to follow-up negotiations. None of those statements can all be true simultaneously, and all of this is happening on the same calendar day that Russia fired the Arctic nuclear-capable hypersonic missile at the Kyiv region of Ukraine, alongside 600 drones in the single biggest overnight attack on Ukraine's capital in 4 years of war, while Ukraine simultaneously struck Russian oil infrastructure, warships, and military targets across multiple Russian-controlled regions. And China moved 100 military ships inside the first island chain near Taiwan, while its Coast Guard vessel was in a second consecutive day of standoff inside restricted waters near the Pratas Islands. 3 simultaneous crises, 1 Memorial Day weekend, the most complicated 48 hours of the most complicated conflict in a generation. And this script is going to give you the complete picture of every dimension of it. But let's back all the way up, because this weekend's chaos did not begin with a peace proposal. It began with an assassination plot that tells you more about the IRGC's fractured institutional state than any diplomatic development possibly could. Here is the complete sequence that led to where things stand right now, in the precise order it happened, because the order matters for understanding the full picture. On Friday, May 22nd, intelligence reports emerged confirming that an Iraqi national with IRGC connections had been arrested, transported to the United States, and is facing multiple terrorism charges. The suspect had obtained a specific blueprint of the Florida home of a specific member of Trump's family. He had made an explicit pledge that was attributed to him in the Department of Justice charging documents. He said, "We need to kill Ivanka to burn down the house of Trump the way he burned down our house." The burning down the house reference was not metaphorical and was not vague. It was explicitly connected to the American drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC's Quds Force at Baghdad Airport in January 2020. The suspect was not an amateur or a random individual who had self-radicalized. He had been behind attacks on multiple American and Jewish targets previously. He was trained. He was operationally connected to the IRGC's external operations network, and his arrest happened in the middle of a ceasefire period that has been in place since April 8th, a period that was supposed to be producing a peace deal rather than producing assassination plots against the American president's family. This is the first essential fact for understanding everything that follows this weekend. The assassination plot and the peace deal negotiation were not separate things happening in separate parts of the Iranian government. They were simultaneous activities of the same fractured institution running on multiple tracks at the same time, because different factions within the Islamic Republic have completely different ideas about what Iran should be doing right now. The civilian diplomatic faction around Foreign Minister Arachi understands the economics of the blockade, $500 million per day storage overflowing at Car Island with a 71-kilometer oil slick visible from satellite, soldiers not being paid on time, regular army fighting the IRGC in 4 cities, 6,500 arrests since February 28th, 29 executions to try to suppress internal dissent. That faction wants to close the deal because it can read the physics clock that the blockade has set in motion. The IRGC hardliner faction around Moshtaba Kami, the new supreme leader installed by the IRGC hardliners after his father was killed on February 28th, has a different calculation entirely. The uranium is the insurance policy. The Soleimani dud debt is the institutional identity. Surrendering either one is the Gaddafi mistake. Gaddafi surrendered his weapons. Gaddafi cooperated with the West. Gaddafi was killed anyway. The IRGC is not going to make the Gaddafi mistake. Both factions doing opposite things simultaneously is not a contradiction. It is the operating condition of a deeply fractured institution where different parts have different survival requirements and no unified command authority can override either faction's institutional logic. Now let me give you Trump's statement from Truth.social in full and explain why 3 specific words in it were immediately noticed by everyone tracking this conflict's diplomatic language. Trump posted that negotiations are happening and that an agreement has been largely negotiated subject to finalization between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran. The 3 words are Islamic Republic of Iran. Throughout the entire 84 days of this conflict, Trump has not once referred to Iran by its formal official name. He has called it the terrorist regime, the Iranian regime, various more colorful characterizations that reflected his administration's consistent position that the Islamic Republic was not a legitimate governing entity worthy of formal diplomatic recognition in his communications. The
statement used the country's formal, official, internationally recognized legal name. That is the name that appears on formal diplomatic documents. That is the name that appears in treaties and agreements and memorandum of understanding. Countries negotiating formal agreements refer to each other by their official names in the formal communication surrounding those agreements. The shift from terrorist regime to Islamic Republic of Iran in the same message that says a deal has been largely negotiated is not a random phrasing accident. It reflects proximity to formal diplomatic language in a way that Trump's previous communications about Iran did not. Whether this is deliberate diplomatic signaling designed to communicate that something real and formal is being finalized, or whether it simply reflects that the communication was drafted by someone working on formal documents and the language carried through, is genuinely uncertain without additional context. But it was noticed immediately and widely by people who track these specific language signals in diplomatic communications, and it is worth acknowledging as a meaningful departure from the consistent pattern of the previous 84 days. After Trump's statement, both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal confirmed that Gulf Arab leaders, specifically the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, were actively pushing Washington to sign some form of deal because they do not want to return to war. Sit with that context carefully before reading the deal terms, because it matters enormously for understanding why the deal exists at all. The UAE absorbed over 2,800 Iranian missiles and drones during the conflict period. Saudi Arabia conducted its own cruise missile strike against the IRGC command center at Bandar Abbas. Bahrain declared a national emergency and suspended its airspace.
A residential building in northern Oman was struck. The Fujairah oil terminal, the UAE's most important bypass export route, was set on fire by Iranian cruise missiles on May 4th. The Baraka nuclear power plant's outer perimeter generator was struck by a drone. These are the states pushing for the deal. They are not pushing for it because they are naive about Iran or because they want to reward Iranian aggression. They're pushing for it because they live in the region and they are bearing the direct costs of every additional day of conflict in ways that Washington, which is 6,000 miles away, does not. Their preference for a deal, even an imperfect deal, over resumed large-scale military operations is a rational calculation made by the governments most directly exposed to the consequences of either option. Understanding their position as strategic rather than as weakness is essential for understanding why the deal framework exists at all. Now let me give you the deal terms as described by the Iranian side in full detail, with the absolutely essential caveat that everything being reported about this deal is coming from Tehran's information management apparatus. Iran has a 47-year documented history of describing agreements in the terms most favorable to the Islamic Republic. Regardless of what the actual text says, Iran's state media has generated AI imagery throughout this conflict designed to make Iran appear stronger than its military situation actually is. The previous scripts in this series have documented multiple instances of Iranian officials saying contradictory things simultaneously. With all of that context clearly established, here is what 3 Iranian officials described as the Memorandum of Understanding. Iran agrees to halt all fighting, including the fighting in Lebanon involving Hezbollah, which has been part of the broader regional conflict dimensions. The Strait of Hormuz gets fully reopened to commercial shipping without restrictions. Iran drops the $2 million per ship transit fee that the Persian Gulf Strait Management Authority, the fake maritime body Iran created with a verified Twitter account and a professionally drawn map, had been demanding from ships transiting the waterway. The ceasefire that has been in place since April 8th gets formally codified in writing. On the Iranian side of what it receives, according to this description, the American naval blockade that has been in place since April 13th and costing Iran $500 million every single day gets lifted. $25 billion in frozen Iranian assets get released to the Islamic Republic. These are Iranian government funds that have been sitting in overseas bank accounts frozen by the international financial system's compliance with American sanctions. American sanctions on Iran get lifted in phases as Iran meets specific commitments in the agreement going forward. Iran retains the right to a civilian nuclear energy program subject to specific limits and subject to IAEA inspections. And critically, the nuclear question, specifically regarding the 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity currently sitting in sealed cylinders in the Isfahan tunnel complex, gets pushed to a separate follow-up negotiation within 30 to 60 days of the MOU being signed. The uranium does not have to be addressed today. It gets addressed after the deal is signed, after the economic relief flows, after the $25 billion in frozen assets is released, after the blockade is lifted. That is what Iran says it agreed to. Now look at what Iran says it gives up. It opens the strait, it stops fighting it could not militarily sustain at previous intensity anyway, with a Navy at 40% pre-war capacity. It drops a transit fee that the American Navy was ignoring and could not be physically collected without triggering immediate military response, in exchange for $2 billion in comprehensive blockade and sanctions relief. With the most important question, the uranium, which is the core justification for the entire conflict, deferred to a future negotiation Iran will conduct from a position of improving economic strength rather than blockade-induced desperation. Now let me give you the American description of the same deal, because this is where the central contradiction of this entire weekend lives and where the analytical question that matters most is housed.
A White House source speaking anonymously to the New York Times, the same publication that first reported the Iranian terms, provided a different account of what the same document contains. According to this American official, one element of the proposed agreement is an apparent commitment by Iran to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. The commitment is written into the framework document. The specific mechanics of how the handover happens physically, the timeline for transfer, the transportation logistics, the IAEA verification procedures, those details get worked out in the follow-up negotiations. But the commitment itself, Iran's written agreement to surrender the uranium as a matter of binding principle, is in the current document according to American officials. Now hold those two descriptions at the same time. Iranian officials say the nuclear question is deferred to follow-up talks with no commitment made in the current document. American officials say Iran's written commitment to give up the uranium is in the current document. One of those things is true, the other is false. The uranium commitment is either in the document or it is not in the document. There is no version of diplomatic reality where the same document both contains and does not contain a binding commitment on the same specific question. Someone is mischaracterizing what the document says, and the identity of who is mischaracterizing it determines whether this deal is an American strategic success or an American strategic concession of the most important objective the conflict was designed to achieve. There are two serious analytical possibilities. The first possibility is that Iran is deliberately mischaracterizing the deal to its own domestic audience for specific institutional reasons. Here is why this would make complete sense given Iran's internal political situation. The IRGC's foundational narrative, the one it has built its domestic legitimacy around for 47 years, is that the Islamic Republic never submits and never surrenders to American and Zionist pressure. If the framework document actually contains Iran's written commitment to give up the uranium, the IRGC cannot say that publicly inside Iran without triggering the kind of domestic backlash that makes the regime's survival position harder rather than easier. The last time Iran was close to agreeing to something like uranium surrender, protests erupted in Tehran from pro-IRGC forces and supporters who opposed it. The regime does not want those protests right now when it is already dealing with 6,500 arrests, 29 executions, armed confrontations between the IRGC and the regular army in 4 cities, and a population that has been experiencing food shortages, electricity cuts, and unpaid government salaries for months. So if the commitment is in the document, Iran publicly describes it as a deferral to protect its domestic narrative, while the actual text says something quite different. Under this possibility, the deal is substantially better for American strategic interests than Iran's public description suggests.
The uranium commitment is genuine and binding, and the discrepancy between the Iranian and American accounts is Iranian information management aimed at the domestic audience rather than an accurate description of what was agreed. The second possibility is that American officials are describing a significantly weaker deal in considerably stronger language to justify it to a domestic American audience that already has major political figures calling it a disaster. If the deal actually only defers the uranium question to future negotiations without any binding commitment in the current framework, calling it a general commitment to give up the uranium sounds dramatically better than accurately describing what was agreed. Senate Armed Services Committee Chair Roger Wicker is already publicly calling it a disaster. Mike Pompeo is calling for restarting the war. Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz are echoing the same message. If the deal is as weak as Iran's description suggests, the political pressure from these critics would be partially managed by characterizing it in the stronger language that American officials use to the New York Times. Under this possibility, the deal is essentially what Iran's description suggests, and the critics are entirely right that it trades away the campaign's most important strategic objective in exchange for Iran agreeing to stop doing things it militarily cannot keep doing anyway. Now let me give you the critics in full because their arguments are serious and deserve complete analytical treatment rather than dismissal. Mike Pompeo served as Secretary of State and as CIA Director. He has spent his career in the most classified levels of American intelligence and diplomacy. When he says restart the war because there is no point giving up what Operation Epic Fury achieved, he is drawing on knowledge of the Iranian system that most public commentators do not have. His argument is that the military campaign achieved something historically unprecedented. 90% of Iran's defense industrial base destroyed. 161 naval vessels sunk or disabled. Admiral Brad Cooper telling the Senate Armed Services Committee it will take Iran a generation to rebuild its navy. Ballistic missile launch rates reduced by 86% in the first 4 days. The IRGC unable to pay its soldiers. Internal armed confrontations between the IRGC and the regular army in Tehran, Trerez, Avas, and Isfahan simultaneously. All of that pressure converging on a moment where Iran was genuinely desperate, genuinely unable to sustain the conflict at previous intensity, and genuinely facing the physics clock of a storage crisis at Kar Island that was running toward the well-shut-down threshold regardless of what any diplomat said. If all of that leverage gets traded for a deal that releases $25 billion and lifts the blockade without locking in the uranium commitment in binding, verifiable physical form, then the leverage disappears permanently. Once the blockade is lifted, you cannot reimpose it without restarting the conflict. Once the $25 billion in assets is released, you cannot claw it back without starting the conflict again.
The critics are arguing that America traded away the most effective coercive tool it had assembled in the Gulf region in its entire history, in exchange for a general commitment that Iran's track record strongly suggests will be interpreted, reinterpreted, and eventually circumvented the moment Iran's economic position improves sufficiently to restore its institutional confidence. Roger Wicker calling it a disaster that undoes everything Epic Fury accomplished is not hyperbole from someone who has not thought it through. It is the conclusion of someone who has tracked Iranian negotiating behavior for years and sees the same pattern repeating. Now let me give you the Pakistan dimension, because the Pakistani Prime Minister's statement adds a third completely different account to the weekend's competing narratives and deserves careful parsing. Pakistan has been the primary mediator throughout this conflict. Field Marshal I.M. Munir personally asked Trump for the original April 8th ceasefire. Trump publicly acknowledged he would not have agreed to that ceasefire without that specific personal relationship with Pakistan's military leadership. When Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif released his weekend statement, here's what he actually said. He congratulated Trump on his extraordinary efforts to pursue peace. He referenced a productive phone call. He expressed Pakistan's continued peace efforts with utmost sincerity, and he said Pakistan hopes to host the next round of talks very soon. Notice precisely what is absent from that statement. There's no announcement that a deal was reached. There's no confirmation that an MOU was concluded and signed. There's no statement that the parties achieved agreement. The statement says Pakistan hopes to host more talks soon. If the comprehensive deal that 3 Iranian officials described had actually been finalized and signed, the primary mediator, whose country has been facilitating the process since the beginning of the conflict, would presumably reference the concluded agreement rather than expressing hope to host future sessions. The Pakistani statement is the language of active, ongoing negotiation approaching conclusion rather than the language of concluded agreement. This creates a third contradictory account. Iranian officials say the deal is done with specific terms. American officials say the uranium commitment is in writing in the document. Pakistan says it hopes to host more talks. The likeliest explanation consistent with all three is that something close to an agreement exists, as Trump indicated when he said largely negotiated subject to finalization, but that the specific uranium commitment language is the remaining sticking point preventing the document from being formally signed in a form both parties can publicly acknowledge simultaneously. Now let me connect today's Iran situation to the full global picture, because the Iran deal story is the most prominent story this weekend, but it is not happening in a vacuum, and the other things happening simultaneously are not less consequential for the global strategic environment.
While Iranian officials were confirming a deal and American senators were calling it a disaster, Russia was executing the single largest overnight aerial assault on Kyiv in the entire 4-year war. 600 drones, 90 missiles. The Ereshnik hypersonic nuclear-capable missile fired at the Bila Sirva area in the Kyiv region. The Ereshnik travels at Mach 10. Nobody in Ukraine or in NATO currently has a system that can intercept it. Ukraine's air defenses performed extraordinarily, shooting down 549 of the 600 drones and 55 of the 90 other missiles. But 60 drones and 9 missiles getting through a city produces damage in 40 locations simultaneously, fires across multiple districts at once, families sheltering in metro stations through the night, the National Chernobyl Museum nearly destroyed, a school hit while people were inside sheltering from the attack, 4 people killed, over 83 injured. Poland scrambled its air force and allied NATO jets to protect its own airspace, because the scale of the attack was large enough that the country immediately next door felt the need to put military aircraft in the sky. And simultaneously, on the exact same night, Ukraine was striking back. Ukrainian forces hit the Tamftag gas oil terminal in Russia's Krasnodar region, one of Russia's most critical Black Sea oil export facilities, damaging the loading infrastructure that gets Russian oil onto export ships. Ukraine struck a Russian patrol ship in a hovercraft missile boat at the Novorossiysk naval base. Ukraine hit ammunition depots, logistics warehouses, fuel storage, and ground control stations across multiple Russian-occupied and Russian territory regions. 2 countries attacking each other simultaneously across multiple domains on the same night. Russia with the Ereshnik that nobody can stop. Ukraine with drones that have now reached 1,700 kilometers inside Russia to hit stealth jets on air bases in Chelyabinsk past the Ural Mountains. And on the same day, Taiwan's National Security Council reported 100 Chinese military ships inside the first island chain, while Taiwan's Coast Guard was in the second consecutive day of standoff with a massive 5,500-ton Chinese Coast Guard vessel inside restricted waters near the Pratas Islands, 400 kilometers from Taiwan. China probing Taiwan's outer defensive perimeter on the exact day American strategic attention is divided between the Iran deal, the Ukrainian capital being bombed, and the domestic war powers fight in Congress, where House Republicans canceled a war powers vote on May 22nd because they knew they were going to lose it. 4 simultaneous pressure points in 4 different theaters. This is the strategic environment inside which every decision about the Iran deal is being made. A strong deal with real uranium constraint frees American strategic attention for Russia and China. A weak deal that requires re-engagement with Iran in months keeps American strategic attention fragmented across all 4 theaters indefinitely. Now let me give you the full military picture that remains ready regardless of what the deal currently says, because this context is what makes the negotiations meaningful rather than purely aspirational. The ceasefire has been in place since April, but the force posture has never been stood down.
3 carrier strike groups remain in the region. B-1B Lancers are at RAF Fairford in Britain with external hypersonic missile pylons that have never been used in combat before. Delta Force operators have been positioned in the Middle East since March specifically to give Trump the ground option for the Isfahan uranium retrieval. The WC-135R Constant Phoenix, one of only 3 aircraft in the entire U.S. Air Force built to detect radioactive atmospheric signatures, is deployed to Al Adat Air Base in Qatar and Diego Garcia, both locations providing geometric coverage of the Isfahan area where the uranium cylinders are stored. The Washington Post confirmed that the Pentagon has briefed Trump on a plan to fly excavation equipment into Iran and construct a temporary runway inside Iranian territory for cargo aircraft to extract the material physically. Netanyahu said on CBS that Trump told him personally he wants to go in physically and believes it can be done. Trump said on Full Measure they will get the uranium at some point and will destroy anyone who gets near it before the American force arrives. Rubio said from New Delhi on Saturday, the problem will be solved one way or the other. The strike packages being prepared this weekend were real. The military leave cancellations were real. The options are genuinely ready. MQ-9 Reapers are flying a continuous 27-hour coverage at 50,000 feet over the Strait of Hormuz right now, with complete targeting solutions on any IRGC fast attack boat formation before it leaves the pier. The 82nd Airborne's Project Freedom AI command and control network is fusing drone intelligence with manned strike platforms in real time. F-35Bs are on amphibious assault ships with the Marine Expeditionary Unit. B-2 stealth bombers can reach Isfahan from Missouri or from Britain carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, specifically designed for exactly the kind of deeply buried hardened underground facility that the Isfahan tunnel complex represents. The difference between one way and the other way is whether the uranium commitment in the framework document is real, binding, verifiable, and enforced in the follow-up negotiations, or whether it is general, ambiguous, and subject to the Iranian negotiation pattern of agreeing to something in principle while reinterpreting it out of existence in practice. That difference is what the next 48 to 72 hours will begin to reveal. Here is the complete and honest bottom line of Memorial Day weekend, May 24, 2026. An IRGC-connected assassin arrested with a blueprint of Trump's daughter's home, pledging to burn down the Trump family the way Trump burnt down theirs. American military leaves canceled. Strike packages prepared. Trump using formal diplomatic language for Iran for the first time in 84 days of conflict. 3 Iranian officials confirming a deal with terms that give Iran $25 billion, blockade relief, a nuclear deferral. American officials confirming a uranium commitment is written into the document. Pakistani mediator saying talks continue and it hopes to host more sessions. Senate Armed Services Chair calling it a disaster. Former Secretary of State saying restart the war. The Oreshnik hitting Kyiv the same night alongside 600 drones in the worst single overnight attack of the 4-year war. Ukraine simultaneously striking Russian oil terminals and naval vessels. 100 Chinese ships inside the first island chain near Taiwan. And 440 grams of uranium at 60% purity, enough for 11 nuclear weapons if processed to 90%, sitting in sealed cylinders in a tunnel complex outside Isfahan, while the WC-135R monitors the atmosphere above and Delta Force waits for the authorization that becomes unnecessary if the deal is real or inevitable if the deal is not. The world does not yet know which of those it is. The answer is in the document. The document's text is not public, and until it is, every confident declaration of victory or defeat is responding to Iranian propaganda filtered through news coverage rather than to verified text. What is not uncertain is Rubio's closing line from New Delhi. The problem will be solved one way or the other. One way means the grand piano of uranium leaves Iran voluntarily, verified by IAEA inspectors with a real enrichment moratorium and a binding written commitment. The other way means the targeting chain we have described in full, the MQ-9 and the 82nd Airborne and the F-35 and the B-2 with the GBU-57 addressed to Isfahan, becomes the answer to the question the deal failed to resolve. Both ways are genuinely ready. One of them gets used. The next 72 hours will tell us which one.